Good evening and welcome to another webinar hosted by the Greenwich Hospital Medical Library. My name is Veronica Belenkin and I'm the Consumer Health Librarian at Greenwich Hospital. Tonight's webinar is a comic approach to medical education. And whether you have learned about or read comics when you were younger, or you're enjoying the adaptations of them on the screen thanks to Disney and Marvel, you can clearly see the impact that comics have on the entertainment world. However, what might not be as well known is the impact that they are having on the education field. Most often they're incorporated in everyday classrooms at this point. And they're also incorporated now into medical education. And I'm not just talking about academic settings such as universities and medical school. I'm also talking about just everyday hospitals, inpatient facilities, and all that kind of stuff. So this is what my topic is today. I'm going to talk briefly about the brief history of comics, very brief, maybe 1 or 2 slides, then talking about how graphic medicine is defined and its impact on just education and literacy in general. And then we're going to be ending with an interview with our special guest, Casey COUNCILOR. He is an assistant professor of communications, media, and screen studies at the Southern University of Connecticut, and also a published cartoonist who has contributed a lot to the graphic medicine field. Thank you so much for joining us, Casey.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, I always have a disclaimer for all these webinars that this presentation is for educational and informational purposes only. Please always consult your doctor and other healthcare provider for medical advice before making any lifestyle decisions that may impact your health. And all images used in this webinar are sourced from reliable health websites or under the Creative Commons digital license, which means that they are free to use. So a little bit about myself. My name is Veronica, as I said. I am a consumer health librarian. For those who don't know what that is, I find, share health information, whether it be print resources or digital. And in doing so, I help residents of Greenwich and its surrounding communities figure out their diagnoses, what kind of medication they're taking, information about an upcoming surgery, any kind of health information that's relevant to them, and to help them make better healthcare decisions as a result. I got my master's in library science at Queens College, where I in fact also did my master's thesis on how to enrich history classes with graphic novels, historical graphic novels. So it's relevant to this topic. But for now, I possess a consumer health certification from the Medical Library Association. The 3 tenets that I hold dear to during my job is promoting health literacy, health prevention, wellness, and patient advocacy. And I do care about the residents of the community, being a Greenwich resident myself. And in order to stay sane during this pandemic, I have enjoyed walking and listening to audiobooks. Now, Casey will tell a little bit about himself.
Thanks, Veronica. So my name is Casey. I am an assistant professor at Southern Connecticut State University here in New Haven. And I've been here for about 3 years. Moved here from Madison, Wisconsin, where I got my PhD. And I, halfway through graduate school, became a cartoonist. So in my 30s, didn't start drawing until then, and then came across graphic medicine as a really powerful thing from the patient side, and also particularly in dealing with both painful and exhilarating experiences of transitioning as a transgender person. And then in my spare time, I should be doing more walking, but I'm co-hosting a university podcast about diversity at Southern.
What is the name of this podcast, just so viewers will know?
Sure.
If they're interested.
Awesome. The podcast is called Real Talk, Diversity in Higher Ed.
And is this only for relevant for university students, or anybody can tune in? Or
no, anybody can tune in. I co-host with a student, Jamil Harp, who's actually graduating this semester, and we're taking on a lot of hot topics. We just earlier today recorded an episode about transgender athletes in sports. We did one last week about cancel culture. We talked about immigration, undocumented students, race
You
and
guys
higher
are
ed.
treading on dangerous territory. I
Oh,
like
yes.
it.
Yes, yes.
Sure,
But
there's a lot of great discussions to be had. So definitely check out that podcast. And I just will say that you are giving hope to aspiring cartoonists everywhere with your ability to be able to be published at the and being able to draw at 30. So,
that's right.
you know, everybody thinks that drawing and being creative is kind of like a lifelong thing. You've had to like practice for a really long time. And if you're not good at drawing, you'll never be good at drawing. So that is quite an inspiration to know that you don't
Yes,
have to be a perfect artist in order to tell stories with comics. So
that's right.
I think that's pretty inspiring. So good. We shall continue. And the book that we will be discussing at the end is this one. It is, well, can't really see it because of my background, but it is Between You and Me, Transitional Comics. And I will be featuring the website where you can purchase it later on in the presentation. So if you're interested. So what are comics? So that is the definitive question. I did say we'd be starting with a brief history of comics. So Scott McCloud, who wrote the seminal piece, Understanding Comics, he defined it thusly as the juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. There's a lot. And it could be a lot simpler. And the way that I put it, and also William Eisner did in 2005, is that it is simply a combination of visual and textual information that is used to tell a story. And I'm going to condense a lot of history in a few words, but historically, comics have been censored and heavily regulated to prevent discussing serious or taboo topics. Therefore, while it has continued, most of it has been published underground. A lot of people will probably recognize The Seduction of the Innocent by the psychiatrist Frederick Wertham. Yeah, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. But that after, as a result of his condemnation of comics, the Comic Book Authority was actually created in the US that started regulating these comics, and therefore that's why the perception of comics these days is that they're primarily for a younger and juvenile audience, because it is they were heavily regulated to avoid any topics that would be deemed inappropriate for children. And I will be using the term graphic novel and comic books interchangeably, even though in the literary world it is a big discussion and a lot of disagreements as to whether there even should be a distinction. But for the purposes of simplicity, graphic novels are simply longer versions of comic books. I like to use the allegory of comic books being episodes of a TV show, because that's how they used to be distributed, as issues and with the same characters, with longer arching storylines. But graphic novels are just like basically like a 2-hour movie, which will probably win an Oscar, because they feature a lot of social commentary or really social issues. They can be autobiographical in nature and just very feel a lot more prestige. So if anybody's curious about how to actually read a comic, there's this great comic that was uploaded on the internet. It even defines what a graphic novel is. Graphic novels have a few defining characteristics, but they're pretty much just long comic books, and they're basically a medium for expressing information and or artistic ideas defined by images used in sequence. And I love it that it's very meta, this explanation, because she's literally illustrating the fact that these images are used in sequence. So, and not to mention, it actually shows how to read them. So you just follow the arrows and you can see that comics are normally read from left to right, and then you usually follow a diagonal pattern back to the left bottom panel and just keep following that left and right pattern. So if anybody's curious about how to read a comic, I would highly recommend going to this link down here. And this is just one page of that explanation. So definitely look into it if you're interested in learning about just the general design of a comic and how to read it. So graphic novels and literacy. Graphic novels are considered multimodal, which means that they can be used to promote a variety of literacy skills. For instance, the most one that comes to mind is visual literacy, which is the ability to read, write, and create visual images. Next would be media literacy, which is knowing how to access, critically evaluate, and manipulate media. And speaking of critically evaluate, we have critical literacy, which is being able to find and understand new or underlying meanings at a literary work. And I'm sure Casey, who specializes in communication, can tell us a little bit more about that. Do you find that correct in most cases, that that graphic novels would highlight these kind of literacy skills?
I'd say absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that I love about comics is that they work sort of in both ways, that you can, even a comic in a language that you don't speak or read, you can still pick up meaning from that. And at the same time, you can actually condense a lot more meaning on a single page of comics often than you can with just the written word.
So the phrase "picture's worth 1,000 words," it's not just a phrase, right?
I'd say it's not. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would, yes, I think in comics are even richer because of that combination.
Mm-hmm. And if you want to get, I thought this was a really cool example, but I came up with it, so who knows if it's actually good. You can tell me. But so I highlighted and specifically colored and asterisked this definition because it's health literacy, the ability to obtain, read, understand, and use health and care information to make appropriate healthcare decisions. That is also a type of literacy skill. But I specifically, notice how I specifically chose a color that takes it, that highlights it away from the rest of the PowerPoint screen. And it is highlighted, it has an asterisk symbol, and it's capitalized. So if you have visual literacy, you'll be able to use critical thinking. You'll be able to see that the reason I highlighted it is because I want you to remember it for later. So that's an example of having using, colors and specific type of writing style to highlight something. I didn't specifically tell you or mention here that you have to remember it, but that's how you remember it. That was an example that I thought was helpful to remember. But if you want an actual good example, I have this panel from a recently released graphic novel, Won't Get Fooled Again, a graphic guide to fake news. And this is all about how Google and the internet has been just promoting fake news. And because people are not well versed in spotting it and do not really check references and most of the time just read headlines, that's how misinformation can spread. So just in this panel alone, you can tell that there's a lot going on. So this starts with two people talking, and then it goes down to a mouse and a cat just talking in a car. So if you just read through the panels, it is two researchers speaking about how people, despite having advanced technology, they are not really good when it comes to checking references. So there's one guy saying everyone wants to look at Instagram, nobody wants to look at bibliographies. It's very disconcerting, and they agree. And then there's a sequence where a mouse is in mouse land watching a TV, and there's a cat here. Apparently it's President's cat, Star the Cats, I think that's the name of the character, saying, as you know, presidential candidate Stars the Cat is a very rich cat, but did you know that if you vote for him, you're going to be a very rich mouse? Stars the Cat can turn gold into cheese. And the mouse is saying, I was born at night, but not last night. So if you couldn't read that, I just read aloud that last passage. But in the interview that Aaron Studer has in this link over here, you can utilize your critical literacy skill to figure out if there's maybe an underlying meaning in that mouse and cat exchange. And Casey, can you tell what he's talking about using this cat and mouse? He's referring to a specific administration that was in power in the United States.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think that this is a great example of how much information can be conveyed in such a short amount of time, in such
Yeah.
a small space. It's a very efficient mode of communicating and rich.
And the way that it can be interpreted, it can be interpreted in multiple ways. I mean, this is specifically an example of Trump, the cap being President Trump in the 2016 election, but you can interpret it as any other administrator in power that has tried to use the media to spread fake news, as Trump says. So I would really recommend looking more into this comic. It's really great. But I thought it really highlighted the way that graphic novels can help you develop these kind of literacy skills. And that's what kind of makes it accessible to all types of readers, as Casey said, especially struggling, reluctant, and bilingual. And this regards to both children and adults. Again, we're moving away from the perception that comics are just for children. They can be definitely used for adults as well. That in fact, graphic novels are kind of elevated in that way as something for adults because they're longer, filled with more complex issues, etc. And what many people describe is that they connect with readers on an emotional level, that the pictures and the text's interplay enhances the emotional impact that the narrative might have, and that it even brings to light diverse perspectives. I think the biggest example I can think of is Persepolis, that really popular historical novel about the girl growing up in Iraq, seeing all the conflict unfold. I think it really opened a lot of people's eyes to that particular life in that particular area of the world in that particular time period. So brings to life, and with yourself, Casey, as a trans man, you really brought to life your perspective and your transition through your novel. So that's all just two examples, but there's so many out there. And it's important to note that graphic novels are not a genre, as some people might think, that it's actually a writing style, and therefore it can be applied to many different subjects. In fact, many graphic novels are written specifically to teach various subjects like English, math, science, all sorts of subjects, and it can be incorporated into other genres. For instance, there can be graphic novels that are specifically horror, there can be graphic novels that are action adventure, there can be fantasy graphic novels. There's even graphic visual adaptations of the classics. So graphic novel adaptations of Shakespeare have been very popular lately. And I even have a graphic novel adaptation of that New York Times bestseller Sapiens by Yuval Harari. I wish I could show it here. Yeah. So you can see it right here. It is volume 1 of the Sapiens book that he released. I think it was like 2 years ago. It's a very big book, so I was not able to get through it, but I read the graphic novel, and just the pages inside it and the illustrations are super great. So I really recommend it for those who have trouble getting through really long books, and just seeing all, when I go through the book, like literally all the words just go everywhere, and I have to reread a passage several times over just to like actually understand it. I don't know if you have that experience, Casey, but with this graphic novel, I'm actually able to, go back and forth, enjoy the pictures on a different level. So I really enjoyed it. But as you can see, graphic novels can be incorporated into any genre. But using comics specifically for adult education, in the most prestigious academic conference there is, which is Comic-Con, there was a panel in the 2016 San Diego Comic-Con called Comic Books Are Literacy Too, where a bunch of teachers and a bunch of librarians got together and they told the audience how comics can be promoted as tools for improving literacy among adults. And they were discussing the following reasons: that an increased motivation to read, the pictures, they said, served as stepping stones for going through the narrative. It increased reading comprehension, especially among bilingual adults, because there was an interplay of visual and dialogue where the visuals complemented the dialogue in a way that provided context, even if you didn't understand all the words that were being spoken. It actually improved writing ability by simplifying the basic elements of the story. There was a clear beginning, middle, end. You could see where the rising action starts, where the falling action starts, you know. And you can even see a point of view, like if you see the protagonist physically there, you know that it's from their point of view. You know, if you don't see them, you can see it's from their eyes based on the illustrations, etc. And then we have improved vocabulary, because the drawings, like I said earlier, they provide visual definitions. So like I said earlier, it complements the words. So they provide the context that might not be there if you don't know that word already. Before we show the video, Casey, do you wanna, because I know you actually teach cartooning sometimes, which could you corroborate on those? Because as a cartoonist yourself and someone who teaches cartooning, have you seen this improvement in literacy among your students using graphic novels?
You know, I'll say that, you know, we read just a couple books it's a class called Family Stories where students write and draw by hand about their own family stories. Um, but I think some of them come in and they're really excited. The syllabus is a comic, so they actually read the whole syllabus,
Nice.
which is a good trick. I should do that for all of my
Yeah, I
syllabi.
agree. I would have really read that through.
Yep. And then, you know, it depends because sometimes students have the impression that comics will be easy to
Mhm.
create. And in some ways they are, like, as in, like, you know, you don't need to be a fine artist to be able to make comics. And it sure does take a lot of time. And it really is an art form. So some of them take to it very quickly. Um, some of them, you know, some of them have a harder time reading comics than I would expect.
Oh,
Um, and I'll say that they're more likely to read things in comic form often, um, than in text, for good or bad. But I will say that there's intrigue and there's interest. Um, and it also provides an opportunity to teach literacy in a different way, to be able to look at a picture and to determine, like, you know, how large are these figures, how close are they together, what repeating images do you see. So it provides a lot of opportunities to talk about, um, you know, especially subtle and difficult things.
so clearly it's increased motivation at first,
Mhm.
even if it wasn't continued. But I'm curious, what were the reasons that some struggled to read comics?
You know, one book that we read, Hot Comb, by one of my classmates, Ebony Flowers, she writes a lot in cursive,
Mm,
and students have a hard time. Those who don't write cursive or who have not written in cursive, they have a hard time reading that. So it becomes visually sort of difficult. And then I just find that, you know, they may look at every page, but they're missing parts of the story in the same way
mm.
that that might be true in a literature class. You might be missing things that are happening in the story depending on how you're paying attention.
Like the pictures can be overwhelming, or they might just skip some altogether and just let their mind fill in the blank, that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
I think I think it has to do probably with attention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I'm getting mostly first year students in this class. I know that there are classes taught all about comics and reading and studying comics, um, that are wildly popular in other areas of the university. So this one, I'll say that, yeah, I mean, some folks I think are just, they're gazing at the page maybe more than they are reading, because it really is reading. It's less so looking at pictures and more reading. So those who are trained to read critically are able to read comics more easily.
Mm-hmm. It's those literacy skills again. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with you. Like some people think it's simple, but it does involve a lot of your brain power.
It sure does.
And I actually have this TED talk by the former teacher and award-winning graphic novelist Jean Yang that talks a little bit about that and actually mentions some of the things that you just spoke of. So might be reiterating a little bit, but I still think it's an interesting video. I'm not going to show the whole thing. I'll just show from this point in the video, but he is a former teacher and he incorporated graphic novels in his classroom, and let's see what he found out when doing that. Let me get to that point in the video. Let's see, 428.
More than actual me. This surprised me because
Let me get to that.
even when I could be there in person, and much to my surprise, these comics lectures were a hit. My students would ask me to make these for them, even when I could be there in person. It was like they liked cartoon me more than actual me. This surprised me because my students are part of a generation that was raised on screens. So I thought for sure they would like learning from a screen better than learning from a page. But when I talked to my students about why they liked these comics lectures so much, I began to understand the educational potential of comics. First, unlike their math textbooks, these comics lectures taught visually. Our students grow up in a visual culture, so they're used to taking in information that way. But unlike other visual narrative, like film or television or animation or video, comics are what I call permanent. In a comic, past, present, and future all sit side by side on the same page. This means that the rate of information flow is firmly in the hands of the reader. When my students didn't understand something in my comics lecture, they could just reread that passage as quickly or as slowly as they needed. It was like I was giving them a remote control over the information. The same was not true of my video lectures, and it wasn't even true of my in-person lectures. When I speak, I deliver the information as quickly or as slowly as I want. So for certain students and certain kinds of information, these two aspects of the comics medium, its visual nature and its permanence, make it an incredibly powerful educational tool. When I was teaching,
So that's the part of the video that I will stop at. But he is the award-winning graphic novelist of American Born Chinese, which was awarded tons of awards a few years ago and is still being taught in classrooms today. It's just, I think what he said about permanence and the fact that, and I think considering what Casey just told us, I think it's also just because if kids are growing up with it and it's incorporated in the classrooms, they will get those literacy skills. If you are introducing comics to adults at a certain age, it's kind of like how a foreign language might be hard to learn at a certain age. And certain skills associated with learning that foreign language might be harder with age. So perhaps that is why he had more luck with students when it's in comics than maybe someone who's teaching a college class wouldn't have as much luck. But as you can see, I think a lot of the points Casey and Jean talked about ring true. That because more and more kids are becoming visual, they will respond better to a alternative form of learning that incorporates more visual and textual design. So, that is the end of the comics portion of my presentation. We're going to be going directly into graphic novels now, but I've left you all with some more resources for more information on comics. If you go into Google Scholar and type in comics and education, you'll find a ton of studies done by teachers and professors on incorporating comics into education. Just looking at 2020, there were a ton of comics just on COVID-19 and incorporating them into health science classrooms. There were a lot on, STEM related things like math and science. Then we also have reading with pictures, which is what I would recommend for any kind of educators who might be viewing this. There's a lot of great lesson plans in there involving graphic novels of all kinds for all subjects, for all ages and classrooms. So I'll definitely check that out. And then we have one of my favorites, which is the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. If you want to learn more about the history of censorship in comics and learn about relevant cases that have happened in the comics world that have helped it evolutionize. And then also they keep a list of banned books that are, they keep track of the banned books every year. as does the American Library Association, which is the next and final link. If you want to learn about, if you're interested in a graphic novel and don't know where to start, there are best graphic novels for adult reading lists for every year. They archive it since like 2018, I think, is when they started. They have graphic novel reading lists for adults, for teens, and for kids. So they do specify what age group they're appropriate for. But if you want to know the award-winning ones, that's what's going to be on the list. So the list right now, that link goes directly to the 2020 list. So definitely check those out. Is there another resource you would recommend, Casey?
I mean, those are good ones. I was just taking notes myself.
Yeah, I saw.
I think that there are, I pay attention to things that are coming out. I'm just networked with a lot of different cartoonists. That's one good thing, in terms of social media. The one thing I would add to that off the top of my head is the magazine, The Believer, which has been hosting since the pandemic started free weekly workshops hosted by different cartoonists. So they've done dozens at this point, and they're all available on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
So I would recommend that.
What's the channel name? Was like The Believer too on YouTube?
No, they're hosted by the Black Mountain Institute, I think. But if you go to the Believer magazine website, there's a link to the weekly workshops. And they're Friday nights, and all different. They're live on Zoom, and then recorded. And there's a awesome cartoonist, different one every week, doing like a 20-30 minute exercise with people from all over, and then folks share their work. But it's a cool way to start drawing, honestly.
Yes, yeah, I feel like you would be giving those kind of resources, like if you want to be a cartoonist. Yeah, but that was a really good point about social media, because all the authors and all illustrators have their own Twitters and Instagrams and everything. So no better way to get updated on new works or whatever than by following the authors themselves. So that's a really good point. So now we come to the apex of my webinar. How about graphic medicine? Now, how do we define that as opposed to comics? Well, I'm going to let the pioneers define it themselves. So the first person we have is M.K. Serwick. I'm really forget.
Serwick.
Serwick. Okay. Yeah, I actually looked it up earlier, and it's apparently Polish for June. So I had no idea about that. And I was like preparing to say her last name for the last hour, but you've actually worked with her. So
Oh, yeah.
I'm just going to refer to her as the comic nurse from now on.
That's right. She's happy with that.
That's her title. So I'm just going to refer to that. So she and a bunch of other really great people collaborated together and wrote this book, The Graphic Novel Manifesto. And this is actually the first page of that graphic novel manifesto. And the comic nurse defines it as the intersection of the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. And then right below it, we have Dr. Ian Williams, who describes it as graphic medicine combines the principles of narrative medicine with an exploration of the visual systems of comic art, interrogating the representation of physical and emotional signs and symptoms within the medium. This guy's definitely a doctor. He uses a lot of big fancy words. And then last but not least, we have a Dr. Michael Green, who also contributed to this manifesto in saying it's an approach to the education of health professionals, as well as an emerging area of interdisciplinary academic study. So these people, I'm just going to combine all of what they're saying together and say that graphic medicine is a way to use comics to tell stories about illness and patient experience. That's how I understand it. That's how I simplify it. But in general, these three individuals, and as well as Susan Merrill Squire, Kimberly R. Myers, and Scott T. Smith, they're considered the pioneers of graphic medicine, and that they're combining, they're just like people are incorporating graphic medicine, graphic novels into the classroom, they're trying to incorporate graphic novels into hospitals and medical institutions and just overall patient care. Casey, as someone who has worked with some of these people and who has dabbled in graphic medicine yourself, how would you define it?
I mean, I would, everything that you said is spot on. The only thing maybe I would add that is just that it's something that is accessible to, and it's a community made up of doctors, nurses, caregivers, patients. So it's scholars. So it's folks, medical librarians certainly play an important role in the graphic medicine community. So that's one thing that I think makes it pretty unique. There's a comics section that's been running online for years now in the Annals of Internal Medicine too, where you have both, typically, of course, doctors and researchers are the only ones getting published in those journals. But this is a place where doctors, nurses, also people like me are being published in that setting.
Yeah, so you wouldn't think that there would be this kind of subject in a scholarly journal, but I'm really glad that it's seeing much more, featuring much more in, sites like PubMed and stuff like that. So I was happy to see so many articles and studies on it. In fact, you yourself have published a full essay in the form of a comic on which publication was that again?
That's in a scholarly journal called Women's Studies in Communication.
Yeah.
And I have another one I have one that's coming out soon in Critical Cultural Studies, and another one in a journal called QED. But there are some academic journals, pretty traditional academic journals, that are starting to publish and be interested in comics, in scholarship that's done as a comic.
And one last question, would you define graphic medicine as a genre of a graphic novel? Because like I said earlier, we shouldn't be putting graphic novels as a genre, but I don't know how else to say that, this graphic medicine is graphic novels with the subject of medicine specifically. So what do you think about that?
I mean, what I would say, I would just replace graphic novel with comics, because
Okay, so you're on that side of the debate.
I'm a literary, I come from an English and rhetoric background. And so anything that's not fiction, we don't have a good terminology is the problem, because graphic novel is what people use to describe longer comics. And it's not a novel, or some of what we're calling a novel just isn't. But I would say that, yeah, comics is a medium. Comics is not a genre, absolutely. And yeah, graphic medicine is it's a pretty broad area too, because we're talking about memoir. There's a lot of memoir in graphic medicine. We're also talking about patient education. We're also talking about research. And we're talking, actually, Dr. Ian Williams has 2 actual graphic novels that are fiction that he's done that are quite interesting.
Okay. I didn't know that. I'm only familiar with The Bad Doctor, but he's actually gone into the fictional realm. I had no idea.
The Bad Doctor is fiction.
Oh, okay, because I thought it was based on his experience.
I think it's both.
Okay, yeah. So okay, maybe I misunderstood. But yeah, so that's really great to hear how broad it is. So it really wouldn't be right to call it a genre then, because it incorporates numerous genres, just like all graphic novels or comics. I will. So okay. We've basically defined graphic medicine, and now we're going to go into how graphic medicine has been incorporated into healthcare. Many graphic medicine novels are used in patient care and have shown to reduce uncertainty and negative stigma associated with certain health conditions. And as Casey pointed out, most of these novels have contributions by actual medical professionals, or they're even written and illustrated by medical professionals. So you know that they are full of expertise and accurate information, although artistic expression might exaggerate, for dramatic effect. It does certainly reduce uncertainty. It is also commonly used to generate empathy, engagement, and connection through personal narratives. And in fact, there have been patients that have stated that it's almost therapeutic in a way, because it often helps it often helps to know that somebody else is going through, and if it's made visually, it's almost like a mirror for you, and you almost feel like you're being understood in a way. And it'll obviously be engaging because it's visual, but it's also just that connection through personal narrative that makes it universal, not just for the person going through the condition. Excuse me. And as we talked about earlier, it fills medical knowledge gaps for those with low health literacy skills. I mentioned health literacy as a skill that graphic novels can fill. And we all know a lot of the, you don't have to go through 8 years of medical school to understand some medical jargon. We do have the internet, but we also have graphic novels that can accompany that difficult medical jargon that might be a barrier for someone by accompanying pictures or actually having actual definitions actually described in there. There are some panels of graphic novels that I've read that just have a patient and a doctor just going through their normal visit and just talking the way that somebody else would have a doctor's visit. So it's almost like you're there with them, being described everything. So it's almost like a free doctor's visit as well. So next, we say that graphic medicine in patient care can give representation of vulnerable populations. And that is incredibly important right now, considering that bias in medicine is such a hot topic right now. And the only reason we know that there's bias in medicine is because these people are speaking. These are Black Americans, people from the trans community, indigenous populations. They're all treated differently when it comes in the medical system. And in fact, Casey, I will be asking you about that later on in the presentation, about your very interesting experiences. But that vulnerable population, it would be hard to describe it just orally, but just having that visual can just put you in their mind and through their eyes, and it's very helpful in that way. So there have been successful case studies that shown the impact of graphic medicine in healthcare. One of them is a school-based asthma education protocol. There was a series of there was a school that allowed a graphic novel called Iggy and the Inhalers to be distributed among children and parents. And after about a month of reading it, they were able to see an increase in, they were given a test beforehand on their asthma knowledge and a test afterwards. And their knowledge certainly increased as a result. And most importantly, even after 1 month, when they were asked again about that education, it was retained. So that's very important because, you know, with attention spans these days, kids might not be able to remember as much anymore. So the fact that this graphic novel is able to help them retain that information is very significant. And then we also have, that was the case for kids, but there's also another successful case study that showed that graphic narratives improved patient comprehension and reduced anxiety before going for a procedure called coronary angiography. So that was a case study that showed very good results among a group of adults. So it really, again, it really doesn't matter what age you are, this type of medium of graphic novel and the interplay of the visual and textual can help in a medical setting. I just wanted to show a quick example of a graphic guide that I found from the University of Chicago Medicine. They give this to people at patients of a short stay unit at the university. And as you can see in the yellow, it's the patient. They even down here list the role of each medical healthcare provider: nurse practitioner, the nurse, the nursing assistant. It just really goes into detail about what exactly you expect to be treated at this facility. So, and like I have told patients in the past, you have to be prepared to ask the right questions when you're there. They even tell you what questions you can ask while you're there. So it's just a really great guide for anyone who's not sure what their experience will be here. And I think it'll just prep people and reduce anxiety and just be able to help them understand what to expect. So I think these type of guides are really great. Have you seen any of these type of guides in any hospitals, Casey?
I'm trying to think, you know, in terms of the the previous slide talking about reducing anxiety in high stress moments, that's part of work that Dr. Michael Green, who is either, I'm not sure if he's a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but he teaches in the medical school at Penn State Hershey. And his focus is on medical decision making and how graphic narratives, how comics and drawing can really help kind of slow things down. And I guess, not unlike what Jean Yang was saying, that you can sort of move back and forth, but that's a way to help calm people so that they're better able to make difficult decisions.
Exactly, yeah, because a procedure like a coronary angiography, that can be kind of intimidating for some people. And you don't want to look for those images on the internet. For certain
Right.
images of certain procedures, that might actually scare someone. But having these kind of guides can prepare you, and you're better able to face what happens when you're prepared. So
Yep.
I completely agree. So I wanted to share before we go on to our interview with KC, in the Graphic Medicine Manifesto, which I shared earlier, they talk how graphic medicine literature contains precisely the information that is left out of or never considered for inclusion in textbooks. They go further, depicting emotion and feeling and tackling the taboo or the liminal, which I thought was really interesting, because in medicine, or some healthcare professionals, they might seem kind of abrasive or unfeeling because every procedure, every diagnosis is just a textbook case to them, I feel like. And that's unfortunately true of the medical education that they receive, or it could be just from the amount of people they have to see. I don't want to assume how a medical person feels, but that is a common complaint that patients have told me, is that they don't want to go to a medical office or doctor's office because they feel like how they're feeling doesn't matter. So that's also why I advocate for graphic medicine, because of that emotional connection that you feel from that personal narrative, from what that patient went through. You get to see all of it, and it's very raw, it's very vulnerable, and it's just tackling what's not mentioned all the time, which I think is helpful, not just for the patient, but for the healthcare professionals who treat them, because you will better know how to treat the patient if you know what they're going through emotionally and psychologically. So Dr. Ian Williams, who helped write the Graphic Medicine Manifesto, highlighted 3 methods of which graphic illustrators use to depict illness or treatment in his essay, Comics and the Iconography of Illness. So the first is the manifest, where the illustrator shows physical signs of the illness or scars of treatment and they're clearly displayed in the illustration. The concealed, which is the conditions that are normally hidden and are brought to life metaphorically or stylistically through the art. And the last is known as the invisible method, which is where the psychological or emotional sides of the condition or treatment are displayed through artistic expression. So I will be showing 3 examples from 3 different graphic medicine novels. So the first is the manifest. So I want viewers to look at this drawing. This is a panel from Stitches by David Small. And as you can see, based on the definition, it clearly shows the physical scarring that may occur after a procedure to remove a lump from his thyroid. So this is but as you can tell, they're not clearly just showing the physical scar. It's a visual representation that displays both the emotional and physical pain of the author, as this is an autobiographical account by David Small. So as you can see from the face, it's clearly very painful. There's blood coming out of the wound still, so it's probably not comfortable to have. So that is one way that it can be illustrated. It's not a simple drawing of a scar. It's showing all the emotion and the pain associated with it. Don't let that scare you from removing a thyroid tumor, though. This is just his representation of how it was for him. That's really important. And then we have the concealed. I want you to take a look at this panel. This might evoke some nostalgia for some people, as it is remembrance of the game Operation. That is due to in this case, it is highlighting the author's mother, going through all the symptoms of lung cancer. And this is his way of processing what's the doctors have been telling him about it. So as I said, this is a panel from Mom's Cancer by Brian Fees. The game metaphor is how I interpret it, is to represent the symptoms and treatment for lung cancer. As you can see, all the symptoms are listed here and the treatment. And then it's the amount of information here just condensed into one panel is pretty great already. But so I don't blame if some people are turned off by the dark humor that's clearly elicited here, because this is clearly the author's way of processing it. But you can clearly see that it's not a happy thing, as just by the image of the mom in the game. But this is just could be a way for him to cope with the information that's given about his mother's cancer. But I just like the fact that it lists all the information about lung cancer and the symptoms associated with and which could be helpful for someone who had just been diagnosed, or for a caregiver who is learning about it with them. And even if it's not, and not to mention, it's even highlighting the things that can be associated with the cancer, which is the brain tumor, where the lung cancer would take place, and the fact that there would be water on the lung. Last but not least, we have the invisible. And now I'm going to show you a panel here. It's a little bit difficult to see because this is the best picture I could find. But basically, this is the protagonist in the back. His name is Emilio. And these two people are putting Emilio into a home because he was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So in this panel, we have him entering the long-term care facility. And in the second set of panels, we have him in a school being introduced on the first day as a little boy. So what does this represent? Now, this is panels from Wrinkles by Paco Roca. And the right panels illustrate the reality inside the mind of the protagonist. So we can clearly and visually see what he's seeing, because he does not see the long-term care facility. He sees himself as the first day of school as a new boy, going into school for the first time. So it clearly portrays the confusion, fear, and anxiety felt by the protagonist, who has Alzheimer's disease but may not realize that he's currently in a long-term care facility, which is, we call them delusions, but I think it's just what, as the brain is deteriorating from the disease, some memories might be recalled that may alter the reality of the person suffering from Alzheimer's. So I think this is a great way to show readers that the fact that a reality can be unfortunately altered for the protagonist, or for anyone going through this disease. So that is just one great way to show the invisible that you might not know the psychological effect that Alzheimer's might have on someone, but this is a great way to depict it as, memories being confused and not knowing where you really are, and just having that anxiety and confusion all the same. So we've come to a really great place in our presentation where I'm going to show you where to find more information on graphic medicine. The National Library of Medicine has a graphic medicine exhibit where they talk more about what we've spoken about tonight, as well as show recommendations for different types of graphic novels. We also have two sources, Graphic Medicine Blog, which I think is curated by MK, the comic nurse, which we talked about earlier. This is where a lot of the reviews and updated research on graphic novels are shown. And we also have a Spanish version of it, Medicina Grafica, where bilingual readers who are interested in graphic medicine can look into Spanish, graphic medicine novels in Spanish. And those two, Mom's Cancer and Wrinkles, they're both available to borrow from the software and app called Hoopla. And all you have to do is just connect your library card to your phone and pick the public library that's closest to you and that your card is associated with, and you can be able to borrow a ton of titles. And it's not just limited to graphic novels, you can limit it to, it's also, you can get music and movies on there too. So I would start there to see if you can't go to your public library right now, which I understand because of the coronavirus and stuff, you can definitely try and get them through Hoopla. And speaking of the coronavirus, there are a ton of free resources to learn more about COVID-19 through online graphic novels. There's just 3 lists right here. There's a repository, there's a short run COVID comics list. I think one of them is curated by the University of Philadelphia, actually, because a lot of graphic novelists and amateur illustrators have contributed to the research and literature of coronavirus at this time. For instance, here are some educational comics that I found from these repositories. As you can see, this one is titled COVID-19 Myths Debunked. In the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, it's easy to find public health misinformation. Here are some COVID-19 myths that have been debunked, and then they do it in the form of a comic. And there's also this educational one, 3 things to know about how COVID-19 spreads. This was illustrated by Wayman Cow, but it was also, what's significant about it, it was also vetted and edited by a doctor, Yufeng Pam. So you know that it's done with a lot of expertise, that they know what they're talking about. And it's really great to use as an educational tool for any health science classroom or just for yourself and your loved ones, to know what the best way to avoid spreading the virus would be. Obviously, we know that hand washing is a good way to do it, but why not have a visual of how to actually do that? And some people don't understand why hand washing is important. So this graphic novel clearly shows why it's an effective way and what the less effective ways are. Next, we have comics from different perspectives. When COVID-19 occurred, a lot of people were impacted. For instance, there are a lot of comics that come out from the perspective of ICU workers, people in the ER. I actually have the book of which this comic came from. It's called The COVID Chronicles. It's available in my library. True Stories from the Front Lines of COVID by Ethan Sachs. So that'll be available in my library to borrow once the hospital has lifted its visitor policy. And then we also even have COVID-19 perspectives from the Asian community, which has been very vulnerable in this time. This one is specifically by a Polish Japanese illustrator, Lisa Woolrim. I can't pronounce her last name, I apologize, but it was part of an Instagram campaign, #IamNotAvirus, where a bunch of Asian illustrators were posting their illustrations of the racism, the outright racism that occurred during the very intense portion of the coronavirus, when Trump was perpetuating the fact that there was a virus that came from China. So all Asian people had to endure the unfair wrath that a lot of people put on them. So that's what we mean by comics from diverse perspectives. And then last but not least, we have a lot of comics that came out during this time that helps people feel like, hey, I'm not the only one that's coping like this in an unproductive way. GEMMA CORRELL has a series of what do I think I'll do during the shelter-in-place order versus what I'm actually doing. So what I think I'll do, learn to bake. What I'm actually doing, stress eating peanut butter cups. What I think I'll do, write the next great American novel. What I'm actually doing, watching 30 Rock for the 100th time. Or what I think I'll do, culminate a small and thriving plant nursery. What I'm actually doing is planning my dog's Halloween costumes. In my case, I was watching Community for the 100th time. I don't know what everybody else's thing was, but just reading that just made me smile. And that was like the first time I had smiled in months when I read this comic. So it really does, just the comics, just design and perspective, just knowing that there's somebody who felt that way during this time was very helpful. So there's so many comics just like that in those links I shared earlier. So please take a look at them if you're having a hard time, or if you have family who's skeptical, or if you're an educator who wants to help people learn more through a visual way, these comics are well worth looking into. And now we've come to the interview portion. We do have, that did take a lot longer than I anticipated, but we can go 10 minutes over. If anybody has any questions after the fact, we will definitely have room for that in the Q&A portion. Casey, I apologize that this was not as timely as I had hoped, but that is most often what happens during my webinars. I talk too much. So now I'm going to let you talk. So let's start off by, yes, this is a much better view of your book. Start by describing to us what this book is about.
Yeah, thank you. I actually really appreciated hearing, that was a really great overview of graphic medicine.
Yeah, thank you.
Truly. And it's a huge field, and you've given us a really full perspective of what that can look like in a lot of different ways.
I honestly wish I had more time and I wasn't as rambly, but yes, I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
So this book is, it's not a graphic novel, I would say.
Okay.
It's a graphic memoir. It's a collection of comics. I started drawing when, like I mentioned, halfway through graduate school, and I took a class with cartoonist Linda Berry that totally changed my life. And then I took another 4 classes with her. I've worked very closely with her since. And so she's the reason that this book exists. I did a lot of the work with her. She is the editor of the book, and it's through her that I came to graphic medicine and was introduced to M.K. Serwick, comic nurse. And we brought her to the University of Wisconsin-Madison as part of a collective that we had on campus of PhD students in all different fields, the sciences and education, communication in my case, who use drawing in our teaching and our research. And so this book really, it's not solely comics about being trans or transitioning. It's a little broader, a little more holistic. But it is, a story of how through drawing, I came to realize that I was trans and wanted to transition. So the book, in a non-linear fashion, sort of takes you through that.
Yes, it is a
process.
Series of vignettes, and
Yes.
the comics feature almost like chapters in a book that was sort of your process of transitioning and the things that you got out of it as you were transitioning. It was a lot of fascinating things in there. I particularly liked your experiences with everybody treating you differently now that you're a white man. So your perspective on that was very fascinating. And I also enjoyed since this is from a medical perspective, I enjoyed your vignettes, named Dear Doctor. I actually have them on hand right here.
Okay.
This is Dear Doctor number 2, where you talked about, actually, I'll stop talking. Why don't you describe it for us?
Well, so this comic, yeah, I have sort of like a dear good doctor, thank you, and then sort of the opposite, dear
Yes,
bad doctor, this was harmful. So this one was for my doctor through University Health Services, who I just had this. I mean, she was the one who prescribed me hormones, so obviously a very significant figure in my life. But I experienced something in the first time we met that was just fundamentally different for me, which was that when we met, her face, like I was nervous. I flush or I blush easily.
Yeah.
So that happened, but she also was blushing, and just in a, and it was like sort of a small moment, But it stuck out to me because I realized that I never had that kind of interaction with the doctor before, where I felt as though we had a moment of real human recognition. And that put me absolutely at ease. It also helped, I never like meeting somebody for the first time when I'm wearing like a piece of paper, and they're fully dressed. So the comic's just 4 pages, and it is, also just to thank her for, advocating. She went down to the pharmacy at the bottom floor of the building where the office was to make sure that my prescription was right because there was an issue, and just really um, recognized and honored me for who I was in a very vulnerable moment. So this was one that was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And
Yes.
I printed it big as a poster and then gave it to her
Oh,
as a gift because she was retiring shortly after this.
that is
This
so
comic.
sweet. It's like I was just gonna say this whole vignette was like a thank you note in a way
Yes,
to
yes.
her. So, and I love just I don't want to say simplistic drawing style, but it's like it's almost necessary for it to be simple in a
Mhm,
way because you clearly see like the blushing and the visual metaphor of a human leveling. I really love that you clearly show that you both like connected in the
mhm.
fact that you guys were nervous. And
Yes.
the last part really stuck out to me was why have I never experienced this before? I'm from that, it seems like it's not something that's common, and that's why it stuck out so much to you. And I feel like patients really sympathize with that. And have you had a lot of bad experiences with doctors prior to her?
Well, I would say I'm a hypochondriac who fears going to the doctor just in general. But since certainly, you know, before I transitioned, I've been I've been looking this way even before I transitioned for a long time. And so I have had a number of experiences where people are confused by me, surprised by the body that I have. And so at any moment that I can avoid going to the doctor, I often will avoid that as long as possible, except for the eye doctor. That's usually fine. Um, but yeah, I mean, and I just know I have many friends who have had not the best experiences. And when I do find doctors who are trans competent, I mean, that's part of why Connecticut was an appealing place,
Mm,
because of, trans protections, state coverage of gender affirming healthcare, and I work for the state, and places like Anchor Health Initiative, trans specific medical practices.
So is there something in particular that you would like medical professionals and students to take away from your patient experience?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that question. I mean, one thing would be to know that many trans people have avoided going to the doctor for a long time. So when you see a patient who is trans or non-binary, it may have taken a whole lot for them to get to that place.
Mhm.
Um, and just to, um, of course, if someone's in there for a broken wrist, and this is an egregious example, but if they're there for a broken wrist, that doesn't have anything to do with their trans identity or their genitals. So, knowing not to ask or and actually, I say this, but I have a number of friends who have been asked questions about their genitals while they're for like a broken wrist. So not to do that.
Yeah.
And then just to do your best to get people's names right and pronouns right. Um, but yeah, the thing is, I mean, I've had moments where, like, I had a stomach ache last summer in the pandemic, and it was fine. It just was a different type of stomach ache, and I didn't even have it very long. But in that moment, I just had this kind of flash of panic, like, what's going to happen? like what, if I go to the ER, how are they going to respond to me? How am I going to be treated? Um, I just had like great visceral fear about, what might happen in that case, because I've been fortunate, knock on wood, um, I'm relatively young and healthy, so I don't have a lot of medical issues, but of course, we know people have more issues as they age. So I haven't even sort of gone down that mental path, but I would just say to know that um, it may be that a trans person that you're seeing um, has not been to a doctor in a long time and is in a vulnerable position in being in that space. So just to be aware of that.
That's really great. And I think, like you've clearly illustrated here, just having that emotional connection might be great to establish prior to any kind of like talk between you, because
Sure.
I feel like the reason I tell patients, that see me sometimes is like if some doctor is not the right fit for you, you do have the right to go look for someone who's more appropriate for you, that you have more of a connection with, because your experience in particular, I can't attest to it, but I'm sure it seems like it's very emotional, and it's just like, it's very, like you said, it's very tough to be able to explain that to someone, and they need to be on your level first. So again, it should always be patient first. So that's really, I really love how you illustrated that it's not just the patient, it should be the doctor that connects with you on your level in order to be able to talk about something like this.
Yeah, and the other thing I would just add real quick, Veronica, is that a lot of times doctors and nurses will go through trainings, but not necessarily the office staff. And
That's a good
so
point.
I think it's really important to have everyone in the office trained, because
Especially because you talk and make an appointment usually with someone at the front desk, and that might turn
Absolutely.
you off entirely if they're not, talking to you respectfully. So
Right.
I totally agree. So yeah, that's really, there should be just more education in general in medical school. Like, you're someone who teaches, you're a professor of communications. There should be more of an emphasis, I think, on communication between patient and doctor in medical school. I'm not sure what it is right now, but there definitely needs to be more, especially when it comes to dealing with marginalized communities or vulnerable populations. So, but I think if a healthcare professional read something like this and saw your perspective, it would definitely highlight that this is an area that needs to be addressed. And it connected with me too, because I've definitely had better experiences with doctors that I felt like they cared about how I felt, and like also seemed like they were a human. As weird as it is to say, because sometimes we see the white lab coat and we think, oh, they're
it's
like
intimidating.
Yeah, there's what's called white coat syndrome. And the reason that some people's heart rates go up when they measure heart rate is because we're nervous in the presence of that white coat. And we think that, they know more than us, they're better educated, they're just a completely different level of human. So being able to display that level of emotion and making your patient feel comfortable should be number one in the office or any kind of visit. So that really stood out to me and for my profession, because I'm trying to, encourage patient advocacy. So moving on, sorry, but I just really wanted to get into that because that was one of my favorite parts of the comic. So like we said, like we just talked about, a lot of graphic medicine revolves around, personal experience, and using comics to tell those stories is intended to make those personal narratives understood universally. How important would you say creating a personal narrative is in bridging knowledge gaps in medical education for people? Like, do you think it's really, because it seems like a lot of graphic medicine is memoir based or autobiographical based. So how important do you think is that when it comes to medical education, like having that personal narrative?
One of the really interesting ways that comics are being used in medical education is having med students actually draw and create comics, because med school is very stressful. And there's a lot that people go through. And that is something that that Dr. Michael Green at University of Pennsylvania Hershey, or Penn State, Hershey, Penn State, that he works in the medical school and teaches graphic medicine, creates comics with med students as they are, dealing with their first cadaver, telling somebody difficult news for the first time, because that emotional weight and stress, on the med student, like that comics are a really helpful form of learning how to take care of yourself and how to process, which is something that MK Serwick, comic nurse, did in her book, Taking Turns. She worked in the HIV/AIDS ward in
Yes.
Chicago, created a book that's an oral history of the AIDS epidemic from a medical perspective. And again, really difficult stuff that she's dealing with as a nurse. And she started to use drawing as a way to honor those who were lost, but also as a way to process everything that she was experiencing.
Yeah, it's just based on what it's kind of analogous to those COVID comics that I shared.
Mhm.
There's so many people in the medical profession that used it just to cope and
Yes,
understand what was
absolutely.
going on and kind of almost stress relieving.
Mhm.
So it's definitely highlights the power that graphic novel can have, not just on people that read it, but just on the people who draw them. You yourself
Absolutely.
just stated how this your novel helped you figure out who you are. So
Mhm.
it's very impressive. But I noticed that how you've taught medical students you with cartooning and drawing, correct?
I've helped MK do a workshop for nursing students,
So
actually,
do
but
you
no, I
think
haven't taught med students.
Oh, okay. But in that case, in your particular experience, has it been difficult to convince those people in that workshop, for instance, that to consider comics as a valid medium, for medical education or stress relieving or whichever?
Sure. I mean, I've heard this said of med students. I mean, anyone who's a med student has been a highly successful student, very good at what they do, likely very high standards. So if they don't already draw, it can be, and the same is true for folks in law school, actually. It can be really difficult for people who are used to doing things that they're very good at. So it can be challenging to do something that you're not already proficient in. So
Yeah.
that's often a barrier for people. And of course, there are ways to get through that. Um, I have heard this, anecdotally from a number of people that med schools have more easily taken on comics and graphic medicine and drawing than nursing schools, which I would guess in part is because med schools already have clout, already have nursing as a profession and nursing schools are fighting for um, validity or to be, they're not seen on the same level as doctors.
Interesting.
So comics being this low art form, this, like kid stuff,
Hmm.
it almost is like, well, sure, doctors can do anything, but they're still going to be doctors, but our nurse is going to be seen less seriously because they're drawing pictures. So that is the sort of at an institutional level. That said, I've got some great friends who are nurse midwives who have really taken it up and started drawing with patients and in really cool ways.
That's such a shame that the view of nursing school is like that, because they accomplish just as much, if not more,
Yeah.
than doctors. Not to mention they interact probably much more than the patients than the doctors would, for instance, in a
Sure.
hospital.
Yeah.
So that's really surprising to me that they're not seen on the same level.
Yeah.
But it's really great that you've seen like people pick this up.
Mhm.
I'm sure they can express those kind of grievances using comics. So I'm sure
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you've helped them relieve that sort of frustration that they must feel. Uh, and but what as you can see at the front here for viewers, you've actually contributed to a number of graphic medicine anthologies. These
Mhm.
two being graphic reproduction and edited by MK Searswick, Menopause, a comic treatment. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in that and what your experience was contributing to them?
Sure. So the graphic reproduction came out a couple years before Menopause, and Janelle Johnson is a professor who I worked with at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is also a cartoonist. She teaches health communication. And so she and I worked together. We collaborated on a comic, a set of exercises at the end of the book, so that if people are using graphic reproduction in their courses, teachers, here are some exercises that they can do with their class. And we each took turns inking, and we came up with the concepts together, but really we co-created the whole thing. One page, one of us would pencil, and then the other person would ink, and vice versa. So that was a really cool process. And that collection is very different than traditional stories about reproduction. So you've got queer stories, you've got miscarriage stories, which are really rare in public, let alone in comics. You have IVF and a lot of other just stories that are not the norm. So it's an awesome collection of comics. And then Menopause, again, like another thing that's not talked about nearly as much as it should be. In this collection, I have a comic in there about, being it's called Cycles. And it's about, first of all, like being a man and using the men's room while menstruating, which is really,
that's an experience.
It's an experience. And then about just this idea of, somebody had asked me, what is it like to go from a body that has cycles to one that doesn't? And I'd honestly never thought about that, and never related to that part of my physical self. So anyway, again, that's a 4-page comic, but I really appreciate being included. And there's another person who identifies as masculine of center, not as trans, but there are just different stories in this collection as well. So it's not all the same kind of person, and it's definitely like many different drawing styles. So it's a diverse collection, and that one was written about in the New York Times as one of the top 20 graphic novels of 2020, which is awesome.
Yeah, it got a lot of attention, I noticed, and I'm planning on incorporating it into my collection here at the library. So
cool.
It's just like we said earlier, it's like, how else are we going to get these diverse perspectives out there if not through accounts and anthologies like this? And what I'm just wondering is, you chose to create your book in a comic version. You have these anthologies that are in comic version. Do you think that comics as a medium is the best way to present these kind of topics, especially ones that might be seen as taboo or, just not as talked about, or maybe even uncomfortable to talk about even?
Well, I mean, I'll say it's the best way for me. I think different art forms and different modes of expression are good for different things. I'm, of course, particularly biased towards comics. And, what they've done for me and what I encourage others to use them for is, transitioning is a really vulnerable thing that involves a lot of uncomfortable, if not hostile interactions. And I'm a shy person. So before I had comics, I shied away from being out in the world because trying to avoid painful experiences. And once I did have comics, I started to actually seek out those experiences because they would make for good material for comics. So it's made all the difference for me in how I actually live my life. And then when I do, whether I expect to experience something, something interesting, something unexpected, something difficult, whether I expect to or not, as soon as something happens, it's my most fluent language. So something happens and I experience it almost as a comic,
Mm,
and um, have found that. And the other thing that's cool about comics versus something like film
mhm.
or photography even is that the more spare the drawing style, the more readers can see themselves in a story. So,
Right.
and that's, similar to what you were saying about Gemma Correll's comic, that you had this moment of uh, self-awareness or an empathetic moment in reading that.
I feel
Even
like
though,
she was literally in my life.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I've heard from a lot of people how much it means to them, even if they haven't had the exact same experiences as I have. It had a cathartic effect for them reading it. So I'm gonna just, keep making comics as long as I can
Mhm.
for that reason.
Not to mention, I agree with like something like film. There hasn't been many great perspectives or representations of the trans community in
Mm-mm.
film. So I feel like that's another reason why comics need to be utilized more, because clearly film is a little bit needs to catch up a little bit when it comes to that community. So
Right.
um was your book self-published, by the way? Because I was one
Yes.
that's also fascinating to me, because that whole process is probably tedious, and just like having to just self do it, everything from the
Yes.
drawing to the publishing, just it's a very creative effort already. How did you go about that, the publishing?
Well, again, I worked with Linda Berry, the cartoonist, and my house is currently full of books. So, um, we put the book together, found, I'm on the second printing right now, so found the printers to work with, and I there are benefits, of course, to having a publisher. The thing that I do love about the self-publishing is that I have creative control over the book. Um, and when you're working with a publisher, some are fantastic and some are less so. They may change the colors, they may change the size and shape of the panels, they may make changes that actually change the meaning
Mhm.
of the text. So um, I would say the next book that I'm working on, which will be a little while in coming, I would hope to get a publisher for, just for wider exposure.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was probably the wider exposure is definitely a benefit, but I totally agree that you definitely seem to have more control over what your vision will look like
Mhm.
in the self-publishing process. However, I feel like almost losing that creative control might make you lose that personal touch that might be present, that I clearly felt while reading it.
Mm.
So I really hope in the future, if you do choose a publisher, you'll choose one that, you know, aligns with your vision.
Oh,
With
thank
the
you.
way that you would like it to be told. So I certainly hope that is the case. I'm going to leave you with one last question. I know I've already taken up a lot of your time, and I appreciate you and
Of
your
course.
responses so far. So I will choose, I have like 10 questions in front of me. I sent you a bunch. So so in the graphic novel Graphic Medicine Manifesto, it was stated numerous times by these pioneers of graphic medicine that graphic medicine may not be used to develop only awareness of a patient experience, but as a tool for empathy. So as a published cartoonist yourself, do you think that the comic format as a medium is an effective tool for generating empathy, and how so? I know that can be a very broad question, so take your time.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, especially this, the last half hour of this conversation, I think we really have been talking about empathy. Um, and even when I was talking about med students, and when I've read comics from doctors, that gives me a different sense of empathy for what they're experiencing. Um, so I think it works sort of in all directions. Um, and I also know that, one of the main audiences that I had in mind for my book is certainly, of course, other transgender people, but really their families,
Mhm.
and people around them who, a lot of times it can be hard for, like when there's a conflict between a parent and a child, sometimes that parent needs to work that out with a peer or
Mhm.
to talk that through with a peer. They may not, whether their child is gay or trans, they may not be able to hear certain things from their kid. But I thought that this book actually could help parents who are struggling better understand a little bit of what their kid might be experiencing, though of course their child would be going through something different. So I do think that storytelling, just in general, and I do, as we're talking, as I'm saying this right now, I think things like the Moth and other public storytelling venues, comics and otherwise, really do make a difference, for people in being able to reflect on their own life and their own relationships. So yes, absolutely. And in the, before I discovered graphic medicine, I was making comics, but anything doctor, anything healthcare related was just sort of a painful area for me. It didn't even occur to me that I could possibly make comics about what would happen at the doctor's office. And so it was hugely empowering, um, for me to be able to just express things, that have happened in that setting, and to be able to, I've had, other comics that are not included in the book, that folks who educate healthcare providers on trans people, they use the comic as a way to generate empathy, and because you can, here's the research on what's effective, but here's the human side, here's the human reason why this really matters and why it
Exactly.
can make a difference for people. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's and I think in the back of your book you actually have a transcript of an interview you had with Linda Berry, and she, I think, said it very poignantly that she imagines a 14-year-old, kid or kids that are going through this, thinking about transitioning. They might pick up your book and it'll be like a glass of water in the desert. I think that's how she
Oh,
worded it. And I think that's like a really, that just clicked in my head, just like that kind of the power of empathy as we were talking about. It's just they will know finally, in this wasteland of misinformation and misunderstanding and everything,
yes.
that your book could be like a glass of water to them, to just know that there's somebody out there that understands what they're going through and help their family understand what's going through, which is, I think that couldn't be put any better.
Hmm.
So I totally, it was just very moving to read as
Oh,
someone who
thank
is
you.
not, and as someone who does not know the trans experience, it was incredible to read about. So I
Hmm.
think that'll create empathy for those who are going through it and understanding for those who have not gone through it.
Hmm.
So I appreciate you for putting this kind of memoir out there. So,
Thank you.
and it's really great to hear that it helped you out, understand yourself. So,
Hugely.
and for those who would like to read it, please visit Casey Counselor's website, where there is a link there, I believe, to purchase.
Yep.
And there's also more information about these two anthologies. And I also have a link for Casey Counselor's essay that was published in the Women's Studies and Communication magazine. So definitely check that out. And then we're going to just open the floor to questions. I know we are 30 minutes over, but I know Mark is still here. Mark, do you have any questions for me or Casey at the end of this hour-and-a-half webinar? If you have any questions, please use the Q&A. Oh, here we go. Nope, but this is great. Thank you so much, Mark. And this will be, a recording of this will be posted on my website. I'll show you. Oh, that's not it. So this is actually the spot where you can register for more events at Greenwich Hospital. My next webinar upcoming is on sleep resources. And also we're gonna have an upcoming webinar on an update on COVID-19 vaccines. But I'm just gonna show you quickly that you can go to my website, the Dr. Stephen Mickley Community Health Resource section. It's long, but all the webinar recordings that I've done since last year and this one will be posted directly onto there. So, but I can also personally send a link to whoever's interested. I will be sending a link to you, Casey.
Great.
But this is my contact information if anybody wants to get a link from me personally. And this is also Casey Counselor's information if you would like to contact them personally as well. Is that the right email and phone for you, Casey?
That's right.
Okay, great. All right. Yep, so this is great. All right, so I think if there's no more questions, I think we'll adjourn for tonight. So thank you so much, Casey, for your time, your expertise, and just sharing your story with us. I know Trans Visibility Day was last week, but I think you were busy that day.
Yes.
So I have wished I had put this then, but it's still April, and I think trans visibility should be emphasized
All the
every
time.
day. So
Yes.
yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your personal story with us, and thank you so much for your time. And I will just say have a good evening.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Veronica. Thank you.
Okay.